Hello and welcome to the beginning of our new series about Japanese history. We will be diving into this new episode of this new series as we talk about the Edo period, otherwise known as the Tokugawa period of Japanese history. So this is part 1 of our new series, and I am Shielbro6 for the History Armada. Sit back, relax, and I will be your guide as we dive into your weekly dose of history. So the Edo period, or the Tokugawa period, is the period of Japanese history between 1603 and 1867 in the history of Japan, when Japan was under the rule of the Tokugawa Shogunate, which is where it gets its name, and the regions of the daimyos, which were roughly 300 at the time. Emerging from the chaos of the Sengoku period, the Edo period was characterized by economic growth, strict social order, isolationist foreign policies, stable population, perpetual peace, and a new enjoyment and emergence of culture, art, and philosophy. This period derives its name from Edo, which was the original name for what is now known as Tokyo, and this period began on March 24th, 1603, when the shogunate was officially established by Tokugawa Ieyasu. The period came to an end with the Meiji Restoration and the Boshin War, which restored imperial rule to Japan in the 1800s, 1867 to be exact. So I will say, get this out of the way real quick, if I do butcher any of the Japanese phrases or names, please pardon me, that is not a language I am proficient at. So it all began with the consolidation of the shogunate. The Edo period, or Tokugawa period, is the period, like I said, from 1603 to 1867. A revolution took place from the time of the Kamakura shogunate, which existed from the Tenyo's court to the Tokugawa, when the samurai became the unchallenged rulers in what historian Edwin O. Racher called a, quote, centralized feudal form of shogunate, end quote. So a lot of historians like to note this time period because of its rise in what a lot of people consider to be proficient Japanese culture. This is where we get the rise of what we see a lot of in popular media, popular thoughts of art, and popular thoughts of history. So as you can see on your screen here, you can see that art style that is really known and renowned with Japanese history. And we saw a huge influx of that and the emergence of this art style during this period. We also saw the creation of the strict kind of cultural and social hierarchy with people such as samurai, shoguns, and daimyo, which again is something that kind of is an icon now around the world for Japanese history. And like I said, we saw the beginning of this as the Tokugawa clan led its 38 vassals and was removing the control of the Toyotomi clan and the other feudal lords. And so we saw these house daimyos rising rapidly and were rewarded with lands close to the Tokugawa holdings for their faithful service. And as these holdings grew, we also saw, of course, the growth in their numbers, meaning that we saw a rise in what the Tokugawa were able to field man-wise, and they were able to therefore have a more secure and more profound presence on the battlefield, leading to the overall control and seizure of Edo and the creation of this new shogunate. But we saw the Western daimyo have significant victories, such as at the Battle of Sekigahara in October 21st, 1600. And the Tokugawa shogunate did not only consolidate their control over a now reunified Japan, which was very unique for Japanese history because oftentimes it was splintered and not whole. So to have this reunified Japan, of course, was, very important in itself. But we also saw that they had an unprecedented power over the emperor, the court, and all of their daimyo and the religious orders. So they had control of the local lords, the high court, the emperor, and their religious leaders. So overall, they had a complete control of Japanese society at this time. The emperor was held up as the ultimate source of political sanction for the shogun, who was, of course, the vassal and the head vassal of the imperial family. The Tokugawa helped the imperial family recapture its old glory by rebuilding its palaces and granting new lands To ensure a close tie between the imperial clan and the Tokugawa clan and family, Ieyasu's granddaughter was made an imperial consort in 1619. Remember I said Tokugawa Ieyasu was the first man and the one that established the shogun, the first shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate, pictured here. A code of laws was also established to regulate the daimyo houses, to kind of rein those in and make them adhere to a strict law and order. The code encompassed private conduct, marriage, dress, types of weapons, and number of troops that were allowed to be fielded. It also required feudal lords to reside in Edo, remember that's what becomes Tokyo, every other year, and this was known as the Sankin Kotai system, meaning you would have 1 year back with your family and your local clan, but then the next year you would have to spend that in Edo. And it also prohibited the construction of ocean-going ships, and it proscribed Christianity. Additionally, it restricted castles to 1 per domain, or han, and it stipulated that bakufu regulations were now the national law. So although the daimyo were not taxed in the traditional sense of having to give money or resources, they were regularly levied for contributions for military and logistical support. So rather than a monetary tax or a resource tax, it was more of a tax via levy for their generals and soldiers. And this was very important for such public work such as castles, roads, and bridges and palaces to be maintained and guarded, but additionally, there were various regulations and levies not only strengthened the Tokugawa, but it also depleted the wealth of the daimyo. So, in one swift motion, they both strengthened themselves and weakened their rivals. And this was very important for the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate and the beginning of the Edo period for Japanese history. And though it was quite complex, the daimyo did not have absolute limits. They did not get fully restricted. The daimyo did have full administrative control over their own territories, and they had complex systems of retainers, bureaucrats, and commoners within those regions. Loyalty was exacted from religious foundations as well, like I said, and already they had greatly weakened by the Nobunga and the Hideyoshi through a variety of control mechanisms. So they really cracked down on these religious orders to bring them under heel for the Tokugawa and therefore for the emperor. And that brings us to another one of their systems. So let us think of their foreign trade relations, because this is very important, especially with the exposure that Japan got during this time. So, like Hideyoshi, Ieyasu encouraged foreign trade, but was also suspicious of outsiders. They were very isolationist at this time period. He wanted to make Edo a major port, but once he learned that the Europeans favored ports in Kyushu and that China had rejected his plans for official trade, he moved to control existing trade and allowed only certain ports to handle specific kinds of commodities. So let's say you wanted to trade for lumber. Okay, you could only go to lumber for this specific port, and you could only go there for a certain amount of time. So there was regulations on where you could do your trading and for how long. And it was even stricter for the Europeans, especially once they had these European powers coming in. And that led to a period of conflict, but it also coincides with the last decades of the Nanban trade period, Nanban. And during this was an intense interaction with European powers, and on the economic and religious plane, we saw a lot of clashes taking place, as we saw Catholic priests coming in and European way of thinking, but also the staunch Japanese mindset and the regulations like I had mentioned. It is the beginning of the Edo period that we saw Japan build its first ocean-going warships, such as San Juan Bautista, which was a 500-ton galleon-type ship that had transported a Japanese embassy headed by Hasekura Tsunaga to the Americas and then to Europe. He is pictured there left, and the ship, San Juan Bautista, is pictured there right on your screen. And this was very important for the Japanese society and their exposure to the world, because we saw their travels take them from Japan to Americas, where they would go through Mexico, and then across the Atlantic all the way through Europe to Rome. So there was an important aspect to this, because as an embassy, you were getting your foot in the door. So we saw him go ahead and get a lot of negotiation, exposure, and talks set up. And of course, there was what was called as, quote, the Christian problem. And it was in full effect because there was a problem of controlling both the Christian daimyo in Kyushu and their trade with the Europeans. Because Christianity did not spread well during this period or in Japan as a whole, because they were very staunch in their traditional beliefs and their belief systems that were going hand in hand with their political systems. They were very deep-rooted in that sense. And because there was a Christian daimyo in Kyushu who wanted to freely trade with Christian Europeans, that led to a lot of headbutting between the daimyo and the shogun. By 1612, the shogun's retainers and residents of Tokugawa lands had been ordered to forswear Christianity completely. More restrictions came in 1616. 1624, there was an expulsion of the Spanish. 1619, the execution of thousands of Christians. And of course, finally, the Closed Country Edict of 1635, which prohibited any Japanese from traveling outside of Japan, or from ever returning if you did. And then in 1636, we saw the Dutch were restricted to Dejama, which was a small artificial island, and they could not trade on true Japanese soil. So because of the conflicts that they had, we saw this crackdown during the Edo period and the gradual restriction and drawback of what Christians and Europeans were allowed to do in Japan. The shogunate perceived Christianity to be an extremely destabilizing religion and factor within their society, so therefore they decided to target it because of this. And the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 also occurred because of this, in which there was discontented Catholic samurai and peasants who rebelled against the Bakufu system and against Edo. And it called in Dutch ships to bombard the rebel stronghold, which is ironic because you saw the Edo and the shogunate say, we're not going to use European powers and we want them to be restricted. But as soon as the Catholic samurai started to rise up or reject this way of thinking, they used the very people that they had forsworn to bombard the Catholic samurai. So it's kind of ironic, and you can see why there was such a bitter taste left in the mouth, per se. And then we also saw the last Jesuit was either killed or reconverted by 1644. So it was not a good time to be a Christian in Japan. But that is but one aspect of Edo society. So today's episode is really going to be an overview, as I continue here in just a second. And as we go forth with this series, I will be taking advice from you guys over perhaps different people, different clans, different events that you would like to hear about from the Edo period, because the Edo period is rich, because it was an awkward time in Japanese history, because there was a lot of growing pains going on for Japan. It was also very much a transitional period. If you've seen the movie The Last Samurai, you can see a quite fictionalized event of that with the end and fall of the shogunate. But that being said, let us move on to talk about the society during Edo period. So, during the Tokugawa period, the social order was based on inherited position rather than personal merit. And it was highly rigid and formalized with what you could do and where you were set within that order. You can see the pyramid on the right side there. At the top was, of course, the emperor, and then next would come the court nobles, and then together with the shogun and the daimyo following behind. Shogun being, of course, at the front because it is the daimyo ahead of daimyos, per se. So we saw the emperor, court nobility, then the shogun, who would be the Tokugawa clan there, and then the daimyos, which, like I said at the beginning of the video, there was roughly 300, and then the samurai, then the peasants, then the craftsmen, and then the merchants. So you can see how it's kind of reverse of European feudalism, because at least in European feudalism, it was peasants at the bottom, then craftsmen, and then merchants being above them. But here it's kind of flipped, because the Japanese way of thinking was, working with your hands and toiling was more respectful and more worth a darn for layman's terms, rather than, selling other people's works. That's why merchants were at the very bottom. And as you can see with this very good pyramid on the right, you can see the figurehead and nominal ruling court of the court nobility and emperor, because the true power had been seized and diverted to the Tokugawa Shogunate. And then the samurai were, of course, military leader and actual ruling class, being samurai, daimyo, shogun, in order of influence. And there was a lot of these people, but even though that the samurai came out to roughly 400,000 during this period, it made up for only about 0.6% of the actual population of Japan. And that's not a big number considering how many people lived here, because there was a good period of crop and population growth. Oh, not 0.6, sorry, a 6% of the total population. The shogun himself, the Tokugawa Shogunate, had 17,000 samurai retainers, and the daimyo behind him, the other daimyo, only had perhaps a couple hundred to their name and land. And most lived in modest homes, but even though they had such a high status group, like I said, it made up for only 6%. So Japan's ruling class, making up 6% of the total population, you can see the way that scale tips greatly in one way. So that being said, we will of course dive in more to the Tokugawa Shogunate and the samurai of this period in our future episodes, because you can't really talk about this without moving on. But I will say that society during this time in Japan was highly influenced by Confucian principles of social order, as well as Neo-Confucianism, which we will get to further in a second. But also Buddhism and Hinduism also had pretty lasting effects on society at this time, and these belief systems would work together to form this strict social class system that we saw here during the Edo period. And there was a lot of regulations with how you could dress and what you could do depending on your rank, but we also got to see a good growth in the ranks of the population due to this being a good period of peace, especially when compared to the warring periods before this. There was no longer this warring daimyo against daimyo civil war system, so that allowed for the population to kind of balance out and people to actually go to school, etc. The Edo period passed on a vital commercial sector to be in flourishing urban centers, which means we saw cities such as Edo growing and prospering, as well as there being a sense of urbanization during this. By the mid-18th century, Edo had a population of more than 1 million, and likely it was the biggest city in the world during this time period. Osaka and Kyoto each had more than 400,000 inhabitants as well. And we also saw that this went hand in hand with the growth, because at the beginning we saw that there was a lot of growth because rice paddies grew from 1.6 million to 3 million within 100 years. And that means that the prosperity of the nation was dependent upon the rice, but since the rice was doing so well because there was no war and there was no drought, for the most part, that the population was able to stabilize. And, in fact, rice production increased steadily and the population remained stable, which also led to the embracement and expansion of financial systems and society into this new form of agricultural and economic societies, as well as that Neo-Confucian ideology of the shogunate that I mentioned beforehand, which really influenced education and the ability for people to learn and live a prosperous life. Because even though you are stuck in that rigid class system, at least you had growth within that system, within your class. You may not move up vertically, but you could prosper horizontally. And that saw the establishment under the daimyos of the Han schools, as pictured here in this depiction of the Terrakura private educational school. And within a generation, almost all samurai were literate. So the ruling class of Japan almost entirely was literate, which was a great bound from beforehand when seeing the growth in the literary arts. And these academies were staffed mostly with other samurais. And in the more rural parts of Japan, it was the provincial farmers that were able to go to school. So in the urban regions, of course, it would be the ruling class, the samurai, the higher end peasants and stuff like that. But in the rural areas of Japan, it would be only the more rich and the higher ranking farmers that were able to go to school. And we saw a growth in literacy across Japan as a whole. And it is an estimate that during the Edo period, it is thought that up to a third of the males could read, as well as up to a fifth of women, which is a very good standard during this time period as a whole. And we also saw, of course, improvements in the ability to make properties for education, such as the new woodblock printing sets, the expansion in gardening, cooking, scripts, novels, and other forms of culture. So we saw overall a growth in that aspect. And like I said, that brings us to a growth in philosophy and religion. Of course, there is the Neo-Confucian studies and Neo-Confucianism that was a major intellectual development during the Tokugawa period, but we also saw Buddhist clerics, as well as a touch of Hinduism in the way that it flowed and the feudal norms class to class that were oriented. And we did see a growth and reconnection with the Confucian ways of teaching, and although Buddhism was not as politically powerful as it had been in the past, it was still continued, and it still managed to be a prominent and proficient religion amongst the upper classes. And Shinto was also still very important in Tokugawa, Japan. So we saw Shinto, Buddhism, and Neo-Confucianism kind of melding together to form the building blocks of how the society worked. And we also, with these new expansion of ways of printing, as well as exposure to new ideas, literacy rates going up, and exposure from Europeans, we saw a breakthrough in a lot of intellectual property, as well as just academic research as a whole, as you can see on the right here, which was Japan's first treatise of anatomy, which was published in the 1700s. And by this time, they were exposed to both Western sciences and techniques, as well as the Dutch studies, as that was become called in Tokugawa period, but also their own growth and advancements in both their spiritual and mechanical aspects of life, as we saw a slow advancement into Japan's modernization. And of course, like I had mentioned at the beginning of this video, this time period is where we really get this sense of Japanese art and culture and entertainment. And this time period is often what we see in a lot of mangas, animes, and video games. And it is often the center of pop culture for Japan when talking about its history. It's these art forms and these appearances of how their art looked that we see in our modern popular media. As well as we saw the expansion of their schools, like I mentioned, but we also saw the expansion of art and culture as a whole, with new plays being done, art expanding, art becoming more accessible, as well as other forms of media. And since this was the end of the period of civil wars and the development of the economy, many crafts with high artistic value were being able to be produced now. So clockwork was becoming a more frequent thing, artwork was becoming prevalent because it was possible to do so. Without a frequent civil war happening all the time, you're actually able to get things done. It's crazy how that works sometimes. When you're able to actually have a proficient period of peace, you can expand the inside of your nation to magnificent bounds, really. I mean, we saw such a huge expansion of their popular stories, their artwork, their sculptures, their printing, just so many aspects that we'll get into in future episodes. And, of course, we do see a change in fashion, until at the very end we are brought to the decline of the Tokugawa and the end of seclusion. But we will get into that in a future episode down the line when we close out our new series on the Edo period. So I hope you enjoyed today's overview of the Edo period of Tokugawa Japan, and I hope you are excited as I am for our new series that we are about to begin. Again, I will say, if you have any figures, any events, any aspects of the Edo period you would like me to talk about, just let me know. And if you have any comments, suggestions, concerns, anything like that at all, put that in the comment section down below for me. I am really excited to do this series because the Edo period and Japanese history as a whole is really fascinating to me, so I'm excited to share this with you guys, and I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please make sure you hit that like and subscribe button for me. But until the next episode, that's it for me today. I'm ShieldBro6 for the History Armada, and I'll catch y'all next time. Thanks for watching.